It was a cold and gray November day, and I was standing in a vacant lot in Chicago, the damp wind whipping me to the bone as I surveyed my surroundings. Small pieces of charred wood and dry wall covered in soot, combined with shards of broken glass dotted the ground, and small pieces of light debris whizzed across the lot, driven by the incessant wind. I thought the scene was a fitting metaphor for what my life had become. A burned-out, empty shell of what it had been, cold and desolate, a monument to loneliness, bitterness, and failure. I kicked the piece of concrete and continued to think hard about what, if anything, I could do with what I had left. I met Olivia at a charity fundraiser a few weeks after my 29th birthday. At the time, I was essentially the second person in the family retail business, and my great-uncle Seth, the main shareholder and CEO, told me to attend the event to fly the flag, try to make friends, and maybe get the business off the ground. The event was boring to the extreme, filled with overly dramatic, self-important people who thought that raising a few $1,000s to build a local library put them on the same level as Mother Teresa. I was trying to be polite, nodding, smiling absent-mindedly, occasionally biting my tongue until it bled, and desperately hoping I'd be able to leave early when she quietly lowered herself into the seat next to me, flashed a 1,000-watt smile, and spoke as if we were old friends. Olivia was light and graceful, slender, brown-haired with bronzed skin, exuding confidence and ease of conversation. And suddenly, I didn't mind the fundraiser at all. I've always been a pretty tenacious and competitive guy in school, work, or sports, but I've never felt particularly comfortable in social situations. Even from my days in business school, I was more or less married to my job, and that, combined with my inherent social awkwardness, made it doubly difficult to develop any experience with women. Because of my shyness, I almost never approached a woman for a date unless I'd known her for a long time. But I found Olivia irresistible, and by the end of the evening I'd asked her out to dinner. We ended up having a great time, and contrary to my fears, we found common interests and had a lot to talk about. I quickly fell in love with her, and the feeling was mutual, and by the time I drove her home, it was clear that we would be seeing each other often. We dated for a couple months while the romance picked up steam, and soon we were seeing each other a couple times a week and spending quite a bit of time on each date. I obviously liked her and was more than interested in getting her into bed, but I wasn't at all sure how to take the next step forward without risking a painful rejection or even scaring her off completely. I wasn't a virgin, but I hadn't had much experience with women either, and I'd always assumed that being lustful was a man's thing. Olivia readily dissuaded me of that. Up until that point, it had been the most pleasurable activity of my life. From that point on, intimacy became frequent and easy as our relationship deepened. A few months later, we began living together, and a little over a year after we met, we were married. We moved into a 4-bedroom house in a beautiful tree-lined neighborhood, did a little landscaping, got a dog, and life has been very, very good. Almost everything about marriage suited me. An end to the loneliness I didn't want to admit. Unconditional emotional support. The physical satisfaction of meaningful sex, and having someone to love and be loved by. It was everything I wanted and more. Of course, there were challenges. I'd always been a bit uptight at work, so Olivia was a little disappointed in my availability, and I suppose there were a few other habits she found a little annoying. Naturally, there were a few things that annoyed me too. Probably the biggest problem was that we had to socialize with her family far more often than I would have liked. Don't get me wrong, I didn't dislike her family. They were lovely, decent people, generally polite, and didn't have any particularly unpleasant personality traits. But I just didn't want to spend much time with them. Her parents were an outgoing, friendly couple, and they seemed to like me. But they tended to lecture us on how we should live our lives and put a certain amount of pressure on us to have children. But we were never around each other long enough for it to particularly annoy me, so it wasn't much of a problem. Her younger sister Mindy and her husband were a little more problematic for me. Mindy was a shorter and slightly more rounded version of Olivia. She dressed like Olivia, talked like Olivia, and when Olivia was around, never strayed more than a few minutes away from her. They were like virtual Siamese twins, whispering conspiratorially, laughing at inside jokes and gossiping shamelessly about friends and relatives. And since she and her husband lived 15 minutes away, we spent quite a bit of time together. I guess there was nothing wrong with that, and maybe it was jealousy, but when she was with Mindy, she wasn't really with me, and that couldn't help but be frustrating. Mindy's husband wasn't making things any better either. He was a tall, blonde-haired, good-looking guy named Bruce, friendly, malleable, and in my opinion, not too smart. He got his family's furniture store in Joliet, and it was his favorite, and sometimes only, topic of conversation. He talked about the store like it was Microsoft, and he was Bill Gates, bragging about how well he was doing, and that no one else in the furniture business knew what they were doing. The problem with that mindset was that the store was struggling, and I was sure that anyone with even the slightest knowledge of business knew that part of the problem was Bruce himself. But I wanted peace, and I wanted Olivia to be happy, and that meant not causing problems in her family. So I spent more than one evening nodding my head numbly, listening to Bruce continue. We'd been married almost 2 years when Olivia first asked me to help Mindy and Bruce. She had cooked a fancy dinner with candles and mood music and dressed in a way that promised a nice night in bed, so like a typical first-time husband, I thought she was just interested in having a great romp in the hay with me. But as the evening went on, it became clear that she had an agenda of her own. She went on and on about how lucky we were to have such a great income and how she thought we could help others. Then, with a look of practiced misery, she confessed how worried she was about Mindy and Bruce, who were just making ends meet. It turned out that Bruce owed some money and was having trouble making payments, and without help, he wouldn't be able to fill his inventory. I quickly realized where this was going and cut to the chase. How much do they want for Liv? She paused and raised her eyebrows, letting me know I disrupted her plans. She chewed her lip, thinking for a moment, and then looked shyly into my eyes. He needs 50 or 60,000. It'll make them free and clear. I almost choked. Yes, we were doing well, but most of my money was tied up in a family trust, and an amount like that would put a very, very big dent in our cash flow. I knew I could get the money out of the trust if I really needed it, but I didn't feel like explaining that to Bernie Blackman, our chief business lawyer, who also handled the trust. He would have done what I asked, but I knew he would be pouncing on me for the foreseeable future to get the money back. He wasn't abusive, he just took his job of protecting the money in the trust, as well as the business, very seriously. Thinking about it, I tried to brush off Olivia's earnest request for the only time in our entire marriage. I don't know, Liv, it's a lot of money. She frowned. Mindy says he has some great ideas and that they'll pay you back right away. They're good for the money, if that's what you're worried about. I'm sure of it. Well, I wasn't sure of that. In fact, I was sure I'd flush a significant amount of cash down the toilet if I sent it to Bruce, but I wanted Olivia to be happy, so I decided to skip the bullet and wrote a check for 60,000, telling Olivia firmly that it meant we'd have to save a little until the money came back. I once heard the advice that if you lend money to relatives, you should realize you'll never see them again. This sets you up emotionally so that the relationship doesn't go bad if and when they don't pay the money back. So, in my opinion, it was a gift. A $60,000 gift to Olivia's sister and her relatively incompetent brother-in-law, which I didn't think would solve their problem because I knew he wasn't a good enough businessman to turn their store around, even with the money. I wasn't happy, but I wanted to be a good guy for her and her family. I wanted them to like me, and I was willing to give up 60 grand to do it. 3 or 4 months after I loaned Bruce the money, I was at home and going through the house looking for a thumb drive that had important data on it. I had a bad habit of absent-mindedly putting important things in unusual places, so I basically went through the whole house. After checking all the usual places, I wandered into the guest room, examined the desk, and even looked under the bed. When I got up, I noticed that it was unusually soft, at least by the standards of Olivia's house, and was definitely in more disarray than my little search would have caused. It was obvious that someone had slept in it and had hastily pulled up the sheets and bedspreads without making them properly. It didn't seem like a particularly big deal to me at the time, but I mentioned it to Olivia in passing later that evening. "Hey, Did someone sleep in the guest bed? I went in there earlier and it was pretty messy. Olivia started to stammer out a reply and looked flushed and nervous. Uh, uh, well, I took a nap there earlier. Sorry. I was doing some cleaning and I was so exhausted I just jumped into bed and didn't have time to clean anything up. At that point in our marriage, I trusted Olivia so much that the thought that her explanation was anything other than God's honest truth never crossed my mind. Moreover, I remember thinking it was funny that she was nervous or embarrassed about needing a nap in the middle of the day. But the bedspread wasn't the only clue I missed. Over the next year, several other strange, unexplained things happened that, if I hadn't stuck my head so far up my ass, might have indicated that Olivia wasn't a paragon of virtue. For example, I took as gospel the fact that her normally quiet job as assistant manager at a small independent bookstore suddenly required her to attend a 5 to 6 hour meeting that was held every Tuesday without a break. The meeting was so important that I shouldn't have tried to contact her at all during that time. I also accepted any and all explanations for the little bruises that appeared on her body, some of which were located in relatively intimate places, or the laundry in the wash that I didn't remember her wearing. And then the orange juice story happened. Olivia started shopping at the new high-end grocery store, which in itself wasn't a big problem, except that she couldn't buy a lot of the things I liked, including my favorite brand of orange juice. I complained about this and asked her to change stores, but she insisted that the new store was better and much more convenient for her since it was right on her way home from Tuesday meetings. Her choice of grocery stores would hardly seem like a particularly strong indicator that she was cheating, but it was this information that got me thinking, which ultimately led to an epiphany that broke my heart. Less than 18 months after the first loan, Olivia began hinting that Bruce and Mindy might need more money. By then, he hadn't paid back a fraction of the original $60,000, and I didn't want to give any more money, especially to support a venture I didn't think was viable. So I brushed off Olivia's suggestion, hoping she would take the hint and stop asking. But she continued and suggested that Mindy and Bruce could lose the business if they couldn't modernize and increase the amount of merchandise. Still trying to be Mr. Popularity, I felt like I couldn't say no outright, so I finally agreed to look at Bruce's business plan and tour his store to see what he wanted to do. I hoped Olivia would let him go if I was at least convinced it was a bad investment. I met Bruce at his store on Monday morning, and with his typical unbridled enthusiasm, he walked me around the store, showed me the floor plan, introduced me to the employees, smiled and patted me on the back like we were cronies when we stopped to talk to someone. He talked about his business plan and told me with great confidence and sincerity how he was sure that a little more money to improve the assortment and a few upgrades would allow the store to make a significant profit in no time. Bruce and I sat down in his office for half an hour, and I shared my doubts. As diplomatically as possible, I let him know that I thought the business had some pretty serious problems. I hinted that unless he could optimize and cut costs and prices, he was unlikely to be able to truly increase customer interest and revenue, even with the changes he wanted to make. I even, very gently, suggested that he consider selling the business and doing some other work, but he took great offense to this and reiterated that he was sure a facelift was all he needed to turn things around. I didn't have the heart to say no directly to his request for money, so I explained that I didn't have enough personal funds to give him a large loan and that it would have to come from a trust. I told him I would go back and talk to Bernie and see if he could clear the way for a loan, but I couldn't guarantee anything. My plan was to avoid conflict and at least give the impression that I was making a legitimate effort to get the money for him before breaking the bad news and essentially blaming Bernie for us turning him down. Cowardly, I know, but I wanted to keep peace in the family and wasn't in the mood to lose that much money. Truth be told, Bernie would have done anything I asked him to do, but I had always instilled in everyone I knew that he had a duty to keep the trust under control, and I couldn't override his decisions. It may seem unfair to make Bernie look like the bad guy, but honestly, I think he enjoyed the role and never complained to me about it. At the end of the conversation, Bruce nodded his head and flashed a wide, confident smile, letting me know that he felt he would get the credit. He shook my hand firmly and gave me another pat on the back, making me feel even more guilty, and I drove away. I pulled out of the parking lot and headed toward the highway, thinking about meeting Bruce and trying to mentally absolve myself of the sins of cowardice and borderline dishonesty I'd just committed at his store. I was driving along, not paying much attention to my surroundings, when I saw something that at first seemed like an odd coincidence, but then developed into a vaguely disturbing thought. It was a grocery store, smaller than most of the big chains, painted green, with a big sign that read, Salvador's. It looked so unusual that I was sure I'd never seen one like it anywhere, but the name somehow brought to mind, and I didn't immediately realize what it was all about. I pondered it for a few minutes before it finally hit me. Salvador's was the name of the store Olivia had started shopping at, a store that didn't have my favorite orange juice and was much easier to get to. Only it wasn't near her work, or near our house, or near any other place where it made sense for her to be during the week. So it didn't make sense that this store was convenient for what she did on Tuesdays, unless of course she did it at a furniture store. Thinking about it, some disturbing options began to emerge. I turned onto the U and drove past Salvador's, and then back to Bruce's furniture store, and sat in its parking lot for a few minutes. I pulled out my cell phone and checked that it was the only Salvador's store in Chicago, and then spent 15 or 20 minutes pondering possible reasons why she might have shopped there. I considered the possibility that Olivia had another office in the area at work, that she might meet Mindy for lunch, that maybe she frequented a health club or something in the neighborhood. But my thoughts kept bringing me back to a conclusion I didn't want to face. Suddenly, I wanted more information, and immediately, so I decided to take the bull by the horns and confront Bruce face to face. I hopped out of the car and strode briskly to the front door of the furniture store, where I noticed a clock painted on the glass indicated that the store was open until 8 on weekdays except Tuesday, when they closed at noon. The cancerous suspicion that had set in a few minutes ago continued to grow. Slamming the door shut, I entered the store and made my way to the first employee I saw, a rather awkward middle-aged man stirring a cup of coffee. Excuse me, I'm on break right now, he interrupted irritably. Look, I don't want to take up your time, but I need to talk to Bruce McCoy right away. I've been discussing some important financial matters with him, and I need more information. I looked at him expectantly, but he continued to stir his coffee and even took a sip, ignoring my request. One of the reasons they couldn't move the goods became apparent, and I waited a moment in stunned silence before I spoke again, this time in a more insistent tone. Seriously, this is very important, so could you bring it over for me? He looked at me warily, but eventually a look of recognition came over his face. You're the guy who was here earlier with Bruce, right? Hey, yeah, come on in. Bruce is meeting with a supplier right now, but you can wait for him in the break room if you want. I don't think you'll be here long. Maybe half an hour at the most. He leisurely led me back to the room and left me with a cup of coffee and the TV remote. I had a hastily devised plan to meet with Bruce decisively and make some bluffs about how I had hard evidence that he and Olivia were cheating. I threatened that if he didn't confess right away, the evidence would get to Mindy and the rest of the family. I decided that if Bruce was cheating on her, he'd crack right away, and if he wasn't, I'd have to live with the shame. Maybe I'd make a joke out of it or something. I paced around the room, going over the speech in my head, how I would suggest that I had pictures or a recording, or even say that Olivia had confessed. As I pondered the confrontation ahead, I began to look around the room absent-mindedly. I rummaged through magazines for a bit and flipped through a few TV channels before I decided to poke around a bit for clues. It gradually dawned on me that if they were using the store for a scam, there was a very good chance it was happening in this break room, and if they were doing it here, they were almost certainly using the battered couch I was staring at. For a minute or two, I contemplated the couch with some anger and trepidation. It was faded and pea green in color, with a couple of coffee stains and a tear in the fabric on one of the armrests. It had clearly seen better days and would probably be better suited in a junkyard or some second-hand store. I pulled the pillow up to me, and my pulse jumped slightly when I saw that it was a folding bed and that it had sheets on it. I quickly checked to make sure Bruce was still in his office, and then unfolded the bed. The sheets were a mess, wrinkled, with a couple of slightly darker, yellowed areas just where you'd expect a wet spot to be. There appeared to be a lipstick stain on the bed, and it smelled faintly of perfume. Opening the bed, I saw some debris on the floor under the couch, so I slipped my right hand into the space above the bed and strained to reach the uncleaned carpet below, pulling up items one at a time. Eventually, I retrieved a pen, 37 cents in change, a broken coffee cup, an empty jelly tube, and a restaurant receipt. The check was from a Mexican place Olivia liked to dine at, and at the bottom was her signature, smooth, elegant, and incriminating. In retrospect, I realized that the check was just flimsy circumstantial evidence that could have been easily explained away with any number of stories or excuses. But somehow, its discovery finally knocked the nasty oddities of her Tuesday meeting schedule, bruises, underwear use, and bed mess out of my mind, and it all came together into a clear picture of a cheating wife and a shitty brother-in-law. Suddenly, my plan to intimidate Bruce into confessing seemed like a bad idea. I needed clear evidence of infidelity, and I realized that confrontation could derail the whole thing, if not make it impossible to prove. But now, knowing the likely time and place of their likely infidelity, I could almost certainly gather the information, the evidence, that I needed to be sure. I rolled off the bed and sat on the couch, heated, with my heart pounding furiously and my teeth clenched. I'd been screwed over in business deals a couple times, and I remember being cheated at cards once, but I'd never experienced betrayal like this in my life. I was on the verge of screaming, crying, yelling, and pounding my fist into the wall all at the same time. But gradually, one burning desire began to emerge from this emotional maelstrom. The desire to get even. I calmed down a little and began to think about my situation, trying to think as detached and unemotional as possible. I thought about Bruce's and my wife's vulnerabilities and how I could exploit those weaknesses to get some satisfaction for my wounded ego when I had hard evidence. My first fantasy was to beat Bruce, but I could only see that as jail time. My second thought was to refuse the loan and insist that I be immediately refunded all the unpaid money. But I remembered what Bernie had told me once when I was considering a loan from one of the particularly aggressive banks. He had advised against it, saying that if you owe someone money, especially someone who doesn't have your best interests at heart, they have you by the balls. And I needed Bruce. I looked into Bruce's office again and saw him standing there shaking hands with a vendor. I waved and smiled at him. He waved back, walked the vendor to the door, and then hurried back to the break room. "Hey, Mike, did you forget something? Do you need more information?" I shook my head and smiled. "Look, Bruce, I've thought it over, and I want to tell you that I may have made the wrong impression today. I really hope you realize that I think you're a great businessman, and I think you have a real winner with this store. But as I drove away, I realized I may have misspoken when I asked about your plans in case things didn't work out the way you wanted." He smiled back. "Oh no, Mike, I get it. Any good businessman will ask the hard questions." Fine. I just want to make sure you know that I really like what you're doing here. Plus, you're a family member, and I need to feel that this isn't just a safe investment, but the right decision for you as a friend and family member, as well as a good businessman. So I didn't want you to go home without knowing for sure that I plan to try very hard to get this money for you, and I can't imagine that we won't get it. Like I said, I don't have that kind of money in my personal accounts, so I'll have to ask for a withdrawal from the trust fund. But honestly, I'm pretty sure I can get Bernie to relent, and we'll get the money for you." Bruce listened with a wait-and-see grin on his face that grew wider and wider as I spoke. "Oh man, that sounds great. I'm telling you, this business is on the verge of taking off, so this loan is as safe with me as it is with the bank. You don't have to worry." "I'm not worried at all, Bruce. Bernie will have to draw up some kind of agreement, of course, since he'll insist on protecting the trust with collateral and stuff. I should be able to get everything signed within a few days. If you don't have a problem with that, I think you'll have the money within a week." The next morning, I wandered into Bernie's office, closed the door, and plopped into a chair. Bernie was on the phone, making some notes and raising one finger as a sign that he would soon be able to speak. I visibly fidgeted as he finished talking, and he obviously noticed this because when he hung up, he gave me a perplexed look and asked, "So, Mike, what made you so nervous this morning?" I cleared my throat and leaned forward slightly to speak. "Bernie, I think I'm going to need access to a trust for a fairly large loan." "Yeah, I guess that shouldn't be a problem. What kind of, uh, what kind of loan? And for how much?" He turned on the computer with the mouse and clicked a couple of icons, opening a spreadsheet that summarized the trust funds. I cleared my throat and leaned even closer. "Listen, Bernie, before we start the paperwork, the first thing I want from you is absolute confidentiality." "Sure, I always—" "No, look, I want you to understand that this is unusual, and it might be tempting to talk to Seth or someone else here at work or in the family. I don't want anyone but you and me to realize exactly what I'm trying to do here." He fidgeted in his chair, furrowed his brow, and after hesitating a bit, began to answer. "Mike, if it's illegal—" "It's not illegal. It's not at all. In fact, I want you to create a document that will be the pinnacle of impeccable legality." He shook his head and I continued. "I want to borrow some money. I want you to draw up the loan documents. I want the terms of the loan to be very clear. I want the loan to be properly secured by the very business I plan to lend it to, and I want the penalties for non-payment to be very, very clearly spelled out." "Sounds like you're expecting a default. Like you want to trap the guy." "More or less." "So who are you trying to trap and why?" I hesitated for a minute before answering, then looked him straight in the eye. "I want to trap my brother-in-law Bruce. And why is Olivia?" He raised his eyebrows in surprise and opened his mouth several times to answer, but never said a word. Finally, he took a sip from the glass of water on the table and choked. "Are you, sure about this?" "Very," I replied. "Very." Within a week, the document was drafted, and I personally brought it to Bruce for him to read and sign. He asked his attorney, a small, unassuming guy named Tim Sowers, who also happened to be his cousin, to sit down with us to go over the document. "Okay," began Sowers. "I went over it last night, and it's pretty much what I expected from a business loan. But there are a couple things I'd like to point out, Bruce, before you put your signature on it, okay?" Bruce flashed his emotionless smile, as always, agreeing and understanding nothing. "Sure. Give me the information, Tim." Sowers cleared his throat and looked at Bruce carefully. I thought I caught a hint of contempt in his gaze, as if he knew how little Bruce understood about how to run a business. "Okay, first things first. This $425,000 loan will be paid off over 7 years. You have a pretty standard rate. Payments will begin immediately, a little over $6,000 a month." Bruce nodded. "Actually, you'll only get $365,000 since we're combining that amount with your loan from a couple years ago. Mike will get his $60,000 back, and you'll get the rest. Okay?" "Capisce," Bruce replied smugly with a slight Italian accent. Tim looked at him again and sighed quietly. "Okay then. The loan is secured. It's tied to your business as well as the property in Keokuk. Is it duck hunting?" "Yes." Bruce pointed to Bernie as he spoke to Sowers. "They, want to make sure Mike's trust is protected in case the business does go bust." He wrinkled his nose briefly, then quickly added, "But that won't happen. The business is in great shape. I think so, and Bernie Black seems to think so." He nodded at me and smiled. "And Mike certainly thinks so. Don't you, Mike?" "Oh, yes," I replied with as much enthusiasm as possible. "Bruce showed me the books, and I think he's got a winner." I smiled. "But I don't know if you know Bernie or not, but he's very, very conservative and always considers the worst-case scenario. He wants to be absolutely certain that the trust is protected, so it's important to him that if for some impossible reason the business collapses, he has something to reimburse the trust with." Sowers frowned, then looked intently at Bruce. "You do realize that in the event of a default, you could lose the business put into the trust? Maybe even the duck hunting lands? Our family has owned them for a long time." "Of course." Bruce spoke earnestly, perhaps trying to convey to Sowers that he understood the warning and was taking it very seriously. I realize there are consequences. You bet it is. But frankly, I'm very confident in the business, and I think taking out this loan is much safer than trying to do business without it. You do realize that as early as 3 months after non-payment, penalties will start accruing? Is that correct? Of course I realize. He smiled at me as if we had some secret, as if he knew I would never let Bernie enforce penalties except for the most egregious violations. I only smiled back. At home, Olivia was beyond thrilled. She went on and on about how well Bruce's business was going to do now that he had enough money to fix the underlying problems. Somehow I managed not to blurt out what I wanted to say, which was that the main problem was Bruce himself, and no amount of money would solve it. But for the next few weeks, keeping my mouth shut about Bruce's business acumen was the easiest thing I had to do when I was around Olivia. I needed to get more information before I could end the marriage the way I wanted to, and that took time. So I knew I would have to control my emotions, which changed daily from melancholy to rage to disgust when I thought about her cheating. Having dinner with her without exploding became a challenge, and sex became something to avoid if at all possible. When I was 18, my friends and I took a trip to San Diego for spring break. One night we ended up in Tijuana to blow off some steam. We drank and eventually ended up in the company of hookers. Somehow I ended up paired with a girl in her early 30s who had obviously had a pretty rough life. She wasn't particularly attractive, and probably even worse than I remembered, given that my ideas of aesthetic beauty had undoubtedly been tainted by a rather high blood alcohol level. But even with 3 sheets to the wind, I had serious doubts about taking her to bed, and I started making excuses, trying to get out of it. But my buddies kept me on my toes, questioning my masculinity, sexual orientation, and all that. Feeling like I had no choice, I put on a fake smile, took a couple more drinks quickly, gritted my teeth, and followed her into the dank, unkept private room above the bar to get down to business. Unsurprisingly, Olivia noticed the change and eventually mentioned it, complaining that she wished she had at least something romantic to do. And I guess in another life she would have made a good living off American tourists in Tijuana. Getting hard evidence of the affair wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. Bruce had used some of the money to remodel the store itself a bit, and there were quite a few workers wandering around during the day fixing something up. I correctly assumed that no one would notice how an electrician, who had $500 of my cash in his back pocket, would insert a camera and recording device into one of the lights above the couch in the break room on Monday morning, a month or so after Bruce got the money, and then remove it again 2 days later. Now I had a pretty good idea of what Bruce and Olivia were up to, so I assumed I was prepared for what I would see from the camera. I figured I'd sit in my office at work with a drink and chips and watch the whole thing as nonchalantly as possible, like a movie. Turns out, seeing your wife having fun with another guy is much worse than just realizing it's happening. Much, much worse. By the end of the tape, I had drunk so much scotch that there was no way I could drive home, trashed my desk, puked twice, and threw a paperweight at my office door. The details are pretty much what you'd expect. I switched to early Tuesday evening and started watching the tape at fast speed until I saw the figure of a woman in a blue dress with a large bag enter the room abruptly, pull fresh sheets from the bag, and spread them out on the couch. I immediately slowed the tape down to normal speed and saw with a sense of grim confirmation that the woman was indeed Olivia. When Bruce finally entered the room, Olivia put the book aside, smiled, and stood up to hug him. Then it's pretty clear what happened. A few minutes passed and I leaned forward to turn off the video when I noticed they started talking into the pillow. Olivia was lying on her side with her head propped up, resting her right hand on her crooked right elbow. They looked at each other, talking quietly and smiling. Olivia began to complain softly about having to use the furniture store as a love nest. Bruce rolled over on his side and replied, "Come on, Liv. If we use the hotel, we'll definitely leave a trail, and we almost got caught when we used one of our houses. We really don't have any other option." Olivia shrugged. I know, but I really wish we had another place to play." I just don't like this room, and changing last week's dirty sheets before we make love isn't very inspiring. Bruce reached up and stroked her cheek, smiling. Well, we can always just run away together. Olivia laughed back, and Bruce's expression turned thoughtful and his smile faded a little. And seriously, Liv, do you ever regret marrying Mike? I mean, I love Mindy, and she's a good wife. But sometimes I don't know if you think it would have been better if you and I had gotten married? Olivia pulled herself up on the bed and sat with her back leaning against the couch, wrapping her arms around her knees, which were pulled up to her chest. She looked at Bruce thoughtfully before answering. Come on, Bruce. How many times do we have to say it? What we have is special, very special. But no, I don't think it would be better if we got married. Sure, we'd be very happy together, but I also love Mike and you love Mindy. If you and I were together, it would just be us. Mike is a very monogamous guy, and he would never develop a relationship with me if I were married, and I don't think Mindy would like that very much. The truth is, Bruce, people like you and me have a great gift of love. We can love more than one person at a time, and we should love more than one person. It's the right thing for us to do. But Mindy and Mike are not like that. Their tendency to self-limit means that they will never be able to do what you and I do. They'll never be able to keep their emotions in check and make everyone happy. Upon hearing this, my outrage peaked, and that's when I sent my paperweight through the office door. Because I loved her, or perhaps because she was the only woman who ever loved me, I probably never realized how arrogant, misguided, and self-serving my wife was. In her imagination, she somehow turned her cheating into some kind of virtue. For her, it was not a stab in the back to her lawful husband, but something that increased love in the world. Something that she was not only entitled to, but was in some way a moral imperative. I slept on the couch in my office that night, and the next morning I drew up the necessary paperwork. When I got home the next evening, Olivia met me with her hands on her hips and a sour expression on her face. Where the hell were you last night? I was terribly worried. You didn't call, you didn't text, you didn't give me a clue. What the hell? I stopped her with a raised hand. I was at work last night. I got drunk and couldn't drive home, so I stayed there. She looked at me with complete bewilderment. Wait, what? You got drunk? At work? I smiled and nodded back at her, and she continued. Well, at the very least, you could have let me know what was going on. I almost called the police. And why the hell were you drinking on the job? She was still looking at me, but there was extreme bewilderment in her question. Without answering, I skipped past her into the living room and plopped down on the couch, planting my feet on the coffee table, placing my briefcase on my lap and opening it. Olivia, letting out an exasperated sigh, followed me into the living room and sat down angrily in the chair across from the couch. Hey, what about Mike's answers? What were you doing drinking so much at work? What happened last night? What's going on? I continued rummaging through my briefcase and pulled out a couple folders, placing them one by one on the couch next to me. Hold on a second, Liv. I want to put this place in order. I sorted through the papers some more, swung my feet off the desk, and leaned forward to put them back where they belonged. I rubbed my hands together as if anticipating a sumptuous meal, looked at Olivia and smiled. Good, then let's get started. What, let's start? Yeah, well, after last night's experience. Last night? What happened last night? Olivia's aggressive attitude when I got home was quickly replaced by something more passive. I began to feel a slight sense of dread. Can you at least tell me what you did last night? Oh yeah, I watched a video. Huh? Yeah, I watched the tape of you and Bruce having fun on that couch in the break room, and I found it a little disturbing, so I guess I must have had a little too much to drink. You realize? I smiled a thin, emotionless smile at Olivia, a smile that reflected bewilderment on her face, followed by shock, fear, and bewilderment. Her mouth was half open and making small spasmodic movements, barely opening and closing, unable to make a single meaningful sound. Her eyes, moist and increasingly moist, darted back and forth from the papers on the table to the door and to me, as if she expected someone or something to come through the door, sweep the papers away, and everything would be all right. Finally, she uttered, I... I don't understand, Mike. What are you talking about? Come on, Olivia. You can't be that stupid. I'm talking about you and Bruce and what you two did yesterday and every other damn Tuesday for at least a year. I gestured to the papers in front of me. I'm talking about the end of our marriage. Olivia sighed suddenly and covered her mouth with her hand for a moment. I waited for her to respond. Mike, we can work this out. I think I can make you understand. Oh, I think I understand, Liv. I pulled a DVD out of my briefcase, held it in my hands, and then motioned it across the table to her. I got a lot of information last night that will help me understand. Indeed, a veritable goldmine of new facts about my loving wife and friendly brother-in-law. She eyed the DVD like a venomous snake, physically recoiling slightly, but making no effort to pick it up. Come on, Liv. It's your copy. I won't tell you how I got it, but I have one of my own to further study your philosophy of love and devotion. She leaned forward and started to stand up, and for a moment it looked like she was going to come toward me, but I held up my hand and stopped her, and she sat down. She bit her lip for a second, and then, looking straight at me, she spoke again, slowly and deliberately, with a kind of false confidence that I suspect was meant to hide the tremor in her voice. Mike, listen, you need to open your mind and think about this. It doesn't make sense for you to ruin your life, our lives, because we have different values and talents. I love you and have always been willing to adjust to our differences, and I hope that... I interrupted her with a mocking snort. Different values and talents? Really? You think cheating on your husband is some sort of talent? Because frankly, Liv, I'm sure everyone does it. Seriously. Talent isn't the right word. She took a deep breath and raised her eyes to the ceiling for a moment, then looked at me again. Potential. I think the right word is potential. I have a great capacity to love, and I can, and have successfully loved more than one person at a time. Barring outdated ideas about love and relationships, there's no reason why I can't or shouldn't use my capacity. Please, just stop. Honestly, you're just wearing me down with your excuses. I get that you think you have some special ability that gives you the right to cheat, lie, and sleep around when you're supposed to be faithful. But really, that's just Liv's bullshit excuse. Anyone can have romantic relationships with more than one person at a time. That doesn't make them lovers with more ability. It just makes them cheaters. In an instant, the apologetic, conciliatory Olivia was gone, replaced by an angry, aggressive, extremely confident shrew. Are you calling me a cheater? She hissed. Well, from your point of view, that's fair enough, I suppose it is. But then again, I've never lost or repressed my love for you or my love for Bruce, so I've never cheated on my emotions or compromised my feelings or actions because of some medieval code that says I have to limit my relationships to one and only one person. So, yes, I may look like a fraud to you, but when I look in the mirror, I have no problem with what I see, no doubts about what I've done, none. She was breathing hard, her face flushed, fire burning in her eyes, and I dared to challenge her. And I did. Is this how you want to live your life? Some loose relationship with lots of different guys, loving one guy one day and another guy the next? Yes, please, to each his own. But pretending you haven't cheated, haven't been dishonest, is pure bullshit, because you've never once let me know you were having fun with Bruce, and you know damn well I wouldn't go for it. You know that. She sensed my fire and turned away from me slightly, avoiding my gaze, but I turned so that my eyes met hers and then continued. So you chose to lie by omission, the greatest omission of truth I've ever encountered. You made me, and pretty much everyone else, think we were a couple bound exclusively to each other. But you went off and started or continued to entertain Bruce, hiding your cheap furniture store adventures as best you could. You told lies and lived lies. And no matter what your weird marital philosophy is, that makes you a cheater. Tears were streaming down her cheeks and her mouth was tightly clenched. She shook her head slowly, rather angrily than sadly in disagreement with what I had said, but apparently couldn't find the words to back up her feelings. I continued to stare at her, waiting for a response, but when none came, I interrupted this confrontation by pushing the papers closer to her. "Read this. Get a lawyer. It's fair." Finally, she spoke. "What if I don't want a divorce?" "Then you're out of luck, Liv, because you'll get one." I paused and added with a poorly concealed smirk. "But hey, it's not like you'll be alone." I moved out that night, moving into an apartment closer to work, and all too quickly reverted back to what I had been before Olivia. A working businessman, a loner who didn't have the time or desire for social activities. The hours I spent at work had become hellish, and more than one person noticed it. But I knew that if I stayed at home, I'd be obsessed with Olivia, endlessly replaying her affair in my head, wondering if she was thinking about me or having fun with Bruce at any given moment. I had no choice but to throw myself into work as hard as I could and try to forget about my marriage as quickly as possible. Normally, in any competition, I would do whatever was necessary to win, and I suppose most people who knew me in the business world would have expected long, protracted, aggressive negotiations to reach an agreement. But that would mean delay, interaction, and pain, and I was willing to pay to get out of the deal quickly and cleanly. I offered Olivia a large lump sum in exchange for ongoing support, threatening to withdraw the offer if she didn't agree to a quick divorce. In the back of my mind, I probably wanted her to object, to insist that we could work things out somehow, to refuse the offer and fight for the marriage. I wanted the tiny chance of survival she thought our marriage had of surviving to be more important to her than money. Turns out it wasn't. After a few half-joking objections, she agreed to the terms, and 60 days later my marriage was over. A couple months after the divorce was finalized, Bruce, predictably enough, began to fall behind on payments. He received appropriate warnings and a nasty letter from Bernie informing him that we would start taking the money any way we could. He called and emailed, making excuses and promises, practically begging to be given more time to pay. I instructed Bernie to play hardball, and we made it clear that we would exercise our rights and start forcing the bailout as soon as legally possible. On the eve of the practice session, Bruce begged to meet with me in person, and I agreed. At that moment, I realized he was desperate and would do anything or take money from anyone to escape the wolves. I wanted the money to come from Olivia. I was looking forward to meeting her. We met in my office after hours. Almost all the secretaries had gone home, but my personal assistant Sherry remained in the outer office, ready to prepare the paperwork if needed. Bruce was nervous, more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He held out his hand, covered in droplets of sweat, for me to shake as he walked uncertainly into my office. Behind him, Olivia lurked behind him, almost timidly, and I had a hard time catching my breath when I saw her. Olivia was sitting closer to me than to Bruce. She was wearing one of my favorite outfits. She was wearing full makeup and flashing her perky smile, and I had no doubt that she had come to try to improve Bruce's chances by appealing to my former emotional connections. I suddenly felt an almost irresistible impulse to rush to her, to hug and kiss her. But realizing the danger of my feelings, I ruthlessly suppressed the impulse, painting a frown on my face and muttering some sort of greeting in reluctant acknowledgement of her presence. Truth be told, I was more than surprised she'd come at all. I'd been looking forward to this meeting for a long, long time and had thought carefully about how it would go, but I hadn't realized Olivia would be there, and I worried that her presence would somehow interfere with my plan to link her to her lover's failures. I considered whether to object, whether to insist that she wait outside, but in the end, decided that her presence might make the outcome more palatable. Bruce began by trying to charm me. After shaking my hand, he smiled as broadly as he could and made small talk about how he wanted to try to make things right, wanted me to be happy, and hoped I knew how much he respected me and that he was sorry for the way things had turned out. It seemed unbelievable to me that he wanted to renew our friendship, that he thought we could be buddies again. I didn't buy it. Without giving out even a hint of a smile, I stared at him and stopped his little speech as emotionally as possible. "Bruce, please stop this shit. Your apologies are meaningless to me, okay? He leaned back in his chair, adopting an expression as if I'd slapped him, and then pressed his lips together, took a deep, concerned breath through his nose, and nodded his head in agreement before starting again. Okay, I'm sorry, Mike. Let's get to the point. He looked at me like this was my meeting, like he thought I should continue, but I just spread my hands in an expectant gesture and waited for him to state his case. He licked his lips nervously and ran a trembling hand through his hair before launching into a story about how he had every intention of returning the money. But, at the moment, it was a little short. He told me that Bernie was playing hardball and expressed doubt that I knew how much pressure he was putting on him to pay up. He then proceeded to tell me that the business was on the verge of recovery and that a little more time, and he could get his head above water. Finally, he tried to argue that I would be in a better financial position if I gave him more time. I leaned back in my chair, slowly, scrutinizing Bruce's nervous smile, the thin film of sweat that protruded on his forehead, and the poorly controlled tremor of his right hand that rested on the table between us. Bruce, if you weren't an outright bullshitter, I might consider extending your contract. His eyes went wide with surprise and fear, and he leaned forward, about to protest when I stopped him with a raised hand. Come on, Bruce. You have to realize that it's almost impossible to trust a man who wouldn't think twice about entertaining his married daughter-in-law. You have to realize that asking for financial help from that same woman's husband is ridiculous. Bruce squirmed uncomfortably in his chair, and Olivia cleared her throat nervously and said pitifully, Mike, please, you can't punish Bruce because... I can do whatever I want, Olivia. I snapped back, giving her a look full of blatant hostility. And why are you here anyway? I thought I could win you over for old time's sake. I still care about you, and I thought that... I interrupted her sharply and loudly. You were mistaken. Honestly, your presence only reminds me of how Bruce figuratively screwed me by literally screwing you. So do yourself and Bruce a favor, sit back and try to look pretty, and keep your comments to an absolute minimum. Tears appeared in her eyes and her chin began to wrinkle, but she did as I insisted and leaned back in her chair calmly. I turned to Bruce again. Okay, Bruce, so it's going to be like this. You'll pay on time on a strict schedule, or I'll start the workout process to get what I can out of the collateral assets. Bruce shook his head aggressively. Come on, Mike. You can't take my business away from me. You can't. I can, and I will if you don't pay up, Bruce. My advice is get the money. Reach out to your family. Find a bank. Sell something. I don't care. Just get the money, or I'll take what I can get. But the banks won't give me loans, or I'd turn to them first, and my family can't help. They don't have that kind of money. I looked Bruce straight in the eye. Don't give me any bullshit about your family not having money. I know they do. No. They would help if they could, but they just can't. What about her? I jabbed my thumb in Olivia's direction. Did you ask her for money? Bruce sat back down. Liv? Liv doesn't have... I laughed. Of course she does. I wrote her a check for $150,000. She's got plenty of money. How about you, Olivia? I grinned at Olivia, and Bruce looked at her with a question on his face. As I suspected, he didn't know about the lump sum. She suddenly became nervous, perhaps a little nauseous. Well, yeah, I know, but I need that money. I laughed again. Whoa, Liv. I remember how safe you thought it was to give money to Bruce when you talked me into helping. So why are you hesitating now? Don't you have confidence in Bruce's ability to turn his business around? Don't you want to help convince me that he's good for the money? If you think it's a good investment for me, why not for you? I looked at her with an expectant, evil smirk. She swallowed hard, looked at Bruce for a second, then back at me. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and said in a defiant tone that she could certainly make up the difference for a while. Bruce smiled at her. She smiled weakly back, and they walked away. Bruce with more confidence, and Olivia with her shoulders slumped in disappointment. Opening the door in front of them, I left them with one last admonition. Remember, Bruce, I don't care how. I just want the money. You'll get your money? He spat back at me. Olivia looked worried. Over the next few months, I continued to try to find solace in my work. Businesslike and efficient with everyone, I continued to avoid any personal conversations at all costs, completely abandoning any social opportunities, preferring instead to work or be alone. I tried desperately not to think about my wife's betrayal and treachery, but everything reminded me of her, even, of course, the monthly check from Bruce that arrived on my desk. The check brought a kind of bitter satisfaction, a feeling that in some way I had been able to drag the authors of my misfortune down with me. The situation got a little worse when Mindy contacted me. She emailed me several times and even called me on the phone. I was quite surprised to learn that Bruce and Olivia had confessed to her, no doubt a softened version of their affair, and that she took it rather hard at first, but eventually forgave them both. To my disappointment and horror, she vaguely hinted that she had guessed that they had been lovers, and that they had come to some sort of agreement whereby Bruce and Olivia continued to see each other. She even made a half-hearted attempt to get me to consider bringing Olivia back. My responses were bitter and curt, and I was sure I had left her in tears by the end of the second conversation, after which I never heard from her again. Mindy's apparent tolerance made it clear that the emotional price Bruce and Olivia were paying was far less than I had hoped. I was very much afraid that somehow the store would become solvent, that Bruce would pay off his debt, pay Olivia back, and that they would all be happy with the outcome, both financially and emotionally. And they would leave me behind, collectively shaking their heads at the poor, unfortunate man who just can't grasp what modern love is all about. I shouldn't have bothered. The furniture warehouse burned to the ground 9 months after I met Bruce and Olivia. It was an impressive 2-alarm fire that threatened neighboring structures and made the nightly news. I didn't see the story, but Bernie did, and he immediately called me to discuss the aftermath. He was furious that I had taken such a risk, as he was convinced that the trust had flushed a fairly large sum of money down the toilet. I calmed him down by promising to personally buy out the loan obligations in the event of default, assuring him that the property itself was worth something simply because of the location. Obvious questions about the fire were asked, and when the catalysts were discovered, the insurance company immediately refused to pay out. With no income from the store, Bruce paid off the loan in full, and I purchased the smoking ruins of the property and 35 acres of land for duck hunting on the Mississippi. The criminal investigation lasted almost 6 months. The detectives put together a pretty good circumstantial case against Bruce and Olivia. They were able to prove that the store was making a loss, and Olivia was shelling out increasing amounts of money each month to keep it afloat. Bruce made several desperate attempts to get loans from other sources, but failed, and then, as quietly as possible, made one last attempt to sell the business. But no buyers were found, even at a grossly undervalued price. Investigators could find no evidence that Olivia or Bruce had been near the store the night of the fire, or that they had purchased anything to start or accelerate it, but their case was built on the theory that they had hired a professional to set the store on fire. They found numerous search terms containing the term arson on Olivia's home computer, phone records showing communication with at least 2 men with arson convictions, and noted that she had withdrawn $15,000 in cash the week before the fire. Olivia and Bruce had pretty good representation, no doubt bought with what money she had left, and the DA, knowing he was in for a fight, started making deals. I believe they started with charges of arson and fraud in the first degree, and then went downhill from there. The defense wouldn't agree to anything less than 4th-degree arson, so the game of sleight of hand with setting a trial date began. I was on the witness list and waited in the lobby outside on the first day of trial. I was sitting on a hard wooden bench, reading the newspaper and absent-mindedly tapping my foot on the tile floor when a court officer came out and announced that the trial was canceled, that they had finally made a deal, and that we could all go home. As I was packing up to leave, Olivia and Bruce entered the room, accompanied by several officers and their attorney. A few reporters jumped up to them and shoved microphones under their noses, but they refused to comment, and the reporters turned to the lawyer. Bruce met with Mindy and left the room with several officers, but Olivia looked in my direction and, without hesitation, walked over to talk to me. I had to admit, I admired her courage under the circumstances. So, Mike, is this your lucky day? Is this what you wanted? For me to be punished for my sins? I laughed bitterly and shook my head mockingly. I wanted a faithful wife and a successful marriage. I never got what I wanted from you. If it wasn't for that, I just wanted my money. She snorted. Well, you're not getting any of that now, are you? Oh, I got some of my money back and took the store. She laughed. And what are you going to do with him? Has he stopped smoking yet? You'd be surprised what a competent businessman can do with a good property, even a smoking one. Her nostrils flared and her face hardened a little. She took a deep breath and paused before speaking again. And you're happier now? Alone? Without anyone? Married to your job for the foreseeable future? She bestowed a knowing smirk on me. Don't deny it. I know you. I know how terribly you dislike meeting new people. I'm working on it, Liv. I've grown to love you, but you're not the only woman in the world you know. She smiled confidently. No, I'm not the only one. But I don't think you can find, what do you businessmen call it? An equivalent replacement? Like it or not, you're going to miss me. I leaned over to her and whispered in her ear. I might be a little lonely, but you won't, will you? The good news is that you'll be living in close quarters with a bunch of androgynous women with whom you can share all that abundant love you have. It'll be a win-win for both you and the lesbians. Olivia surprised me by suddenly losing her composure at my last remark, recoiling from me as if I were radioactive. Her face contorted into a mask of contempt, and her eyes flashed with anger. She inhaled deeply, her chest heaving aggressively a couple times, and then she exploded. You goddamn sanctimonious, self-centered, emotional midget asshole! She screamed as the officers pulled her away from me toward the door. You're going to end up in a hole just like me. Alone, with no one. Married to your goddamn job. As I watched her scream at me, as her love for me completely evaporated, leaving only contemptuous hatred, a sudden wave of melancholy swept over me. I fought the urge to react in a way that would give away my pain, smiled thinly, and muttered some sort of remark about her public use of rather offensive language. But she just continued her diatribe as if I hadn't said anything. But it won't be long before I'm out of my prison and moving on with my life, and you'll still be alone, dreaming of being with me. And then, years from now, when you're married to some boring ex-secretary, you'll still wish you hadn't said yes. The door closed behind her, abruptly cutting off the rest of her tirade. I turned and walked out of the courtroom. The afternoon had freed up my court time, and now, with no appointments or meetings scheduled, and fighting a growing sense of despondency and loneliness, I headed out to the parched parking lot and reflected on my life. The temperature had dropped, the wind continued to ruffle my jacket and burn my face as I looked around, still contemplating what I could do with the wreckage. I wasn't sure if I could salvage the situation, and was most inclined to sell everything, forget about the loss, and focus on what I'd always done. It was the safe thing to do, maybe even the smart thing to do. But I knew there was another option. I could take a risk and rebuild, maybe even open another furniture store. I pondered the possibility of successfully selling furniture in the same location where Bruce had failed. I thought about making a big deal out of it with lots of advertising, billboards, maybe even TV commercials that Bruce and my ex couldn't miss. I could even call it Olivia's and have lots of hot sales. It struck me that the decisions I would make about the plot were similar to the decisions I was unconsciously making about my life in general. Olivia was right about me. My natural inclination, and before meeting her my only inclination to socialize, was to withdraw, avoid the risk of intimacy, and focus on work. I could see that I was inexorably approaching the single life, a financially secure but relatively joyless existence. I was once again becoming what suited me, doing what was safe. I sat down on the concrete block and looked around once more, still weighing my options, still contemplating my future. I was stuck between my fears and desires, the ingrained habits that served me and defined me, and the desire to change, to be different. I was about to leave and go back to work, to let things go and put off the decision until another day, when a few rays of the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds and between the buildings, illuminating a graffiti-stained wall across the street. The light cast a searing orange glow on the wall, giving the concrete and lettering an incandescent appearance. The words were written in bold white letters, clear and easy to read. Act. I've always had a disdain for superstitious people and the way they let irrelevant, objectively irrelevant things run their lives as signs or habits. But here, sitting on a concrete slab in the November cold, those words seemed like fate, a message from God. I pulled out my cell phone and called the office, summoning my assistant. Sherry, who's that architectural firm that designed the new mall that's been written about so much? The one with the glass and the fountains. Hammer, I think. She hummed slightly to herself as she checked. Yeah, Hammerstone. Looks like they're based here in Chicago. Okay, look, could you set up a meeting for me as soon as possible? She hesitated for a second. Are we building something? I looked around the lot, mentally envisioning a new store, and suddenly felt a surge of confidence. Yeah, I think we are. I think we are. Okay. Sure, boss. Anything else? I chewed my lip for a second as my eyes stopped again at the graffiti on the opposite side of the street and read the call to action again. Yeah, Sherry, there's one more thing. You know that jeans rep, the tall blonde Brenda? Brenda White, I think. Yes. Sherry's voice was becoming increasingly incredulous, and I wondered if she thought I was on to something. Can you give me her number? Sure, boss. Do you want me to put her through? No, I'll make the call myself. Thanks. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.